In the summer of 1908, two gold prospectors were found dead beside the South Nahani River, their camps abandoned, their bodies intact, and their heads missing. The men were Willie and Frank Mcloud, experienced prospectors who had traveled into one of the most inaccessible regions of northern Canada, searching for gold. Their remains were discovered several years after they failed to return, deep in a narrow tributary valley far from any settlement or trading post. The location would later be marked on maps as Dead Men Valley, with a nearby stream named Headless Creek. There was no clear record of a struggle, no eyewitnesses, and no reliable explanation for how two men could die so completely isolated, yet in such a specific way. At the time, the discovery circulated quietly through frontier communities, mining camps, and newspapers, adding to a growing sense that this valley did not behave like other places. In the decades that followed, more people would vanish here, some leaving behind camps, boats, or trails that simply stopped. Today, the area lies within Nahanni National Park Reserve, protected, remote, and still largely unchanged from the time the Mclouds entered it. To understand how this could happen, and why the valley earned its eerie nickname, we need to step back and look at the land itself. The Nahani region lies in the southwestern corner of Canada's Northwest Territories, roughly 500 kilometers west of Yellowknife. It is centered on the South Nahani River, which cuts through a wide expanse of mountains, plateaus, and deep limestone canyons, before eventually joining the Liard River system. The scale of the region is difficult to grasp without seeing it on a map, because the valley is not a single corridor, but a branching network of rivers and side canyons. Much of this area is now protected as Nahanni National Park Reserve, one of the largest wilderness parks in North America. Its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site reflects both its geological significance and its relative lack of modern development. There are no permanent roads leading into the park. Access has always depended on long river travel or aircraft capable of landing on water or rough gravel bars. Even today, most visitors arrive by float plane or helicopter, often after days of planning around weather and fuel limitations. Once inside the valley, movement is slow and deliberate, shaped by river currents, canyon walls, and changing conditions. For much of the year, the region is effectively cut off from the outside world by snow, ice, and low visibility. The landscape itself is marked by extremes. The river flows through a series of deep canyons, carved into ancient limestone, some of them so narrow that sunlight reaches the water only briefly each day. Farther upstream, the river passes over Virginia Falls, a waterfall with a drop of approximately 96 meters, nearly twice the height of Niagara Falls. Surrounding these features are rugged mountain ranges, dense boreal forest, and exposed alpine plateaus. Travel through this terrain requires constant adjustment to elevation, water levels, and weather, often with no reliable landmarks beyond the river itself. Long before outsiders entered the valley, the land was known to indigenous peoples of the region. The name Nahani comes from Naha Dehe, meaning river of the land of the Naha people, a name rooted in oral history rather than written record. Dean peoples, including mountain Dean groups, traveled, hunted, and traded throughout the region for generations. Knowledge of routes, seasonal changes, and hazards was passed down through experience rather than maps. These traditions shaped how the land was understood and respected long before it was labeled on European charts. By the 19th century, fur traders began moving through the broader region, establishing posts such as Fort Simpson and Fort Liard along major river corridors. These posts served as hubs for trade, resupply, and information, but they sat far from the upper Nahanni Valley itself. Indigenous trade networks had existed long before these posts were built, and European traders relied heavily on indigenous knowledge to move through unfamiliar terrain. Even then, large sections of the Nahani remained seldom visited, known more through description than direct experience. Into this landscape of towering cliffs, hidden rapids, and shifting weather came the stories that transformed geography into legend. Long before prospectors or surveyors entered the Nahani, the region was already associated with stories that marked danger, distance, and disappearance. Among Diné oral traditions were accounts of the Naha people described as small, elusive mountain dwellers who lived high above the main river corridors. These accounts were shared as inherited knowledge rather than fiction, passed down alongside information about where to travel and where to be cautious. The Naha were said to avoid contact and were rarely seen, placing them beyond everyday experience. Their names surfaced most often in connection with places people moved through carefully or avoided altogether. The landscape shaped how these stories were confirmed and remembered. The Upper Nahani is defined by steep slopes, narrow canyons, and rock formations that affect how sound moves. Wind and water can carry noise over long distances or erase it without warning. In oral accounts, unfamiliar sounds or sudden silence were sometimes attributed to spirits or unseen presences. These explanations were not meant to describe events precisely, but to signal that certain areas demanded attention and restraint. In a region without fixed routes or written maps, stories served as a guide as much as a warning. Researchers studying Diné languages have noted connections to languages spoken far to the south, including Navajo, pointing to migrations that occurred long before recorded history. Within that context, stories of isolated mountain peoples may preserve distant memories rather than literal encounters. These interpretations remain uncertain and are treated cautiously. What matters for the Nahani is that the land already carried meaning shaped by human movement over long periods of time. By the time outsiders arrived, the valley was not an empty space. When fur traders began traveling through the broader region in the 19th century, they encountered these traditions through Diné guides and trading partners. Warnings about specific valleys, narrow passages, and routes where people failed to return were shared alongside practical advice about river levels and weather. As these accounts moved beyond indigenous communities, they changed. Details were shortened or removed, and stories became detached from precise locations. Even so, the underlying message remained intact. The Upper Nahani demanded caution. Trappers working alone during winter added their own experiences. Some returned with accounts of empty cabins, abandoned camps, and sections of river they chose not to revisit. Limestone formations along the river produced low, sustained sounds when wind moved through them, especially after dark. In a place where help could not be summoned quickly, unexplained sounds and missing people were absorbed into existing stories rather than examined closely. This reflected the limits of observation, rather than a desire to exaggerate. By the time gold seekers began arriving in the early 20th century, the Nahani already carried a reputation shaped by generations of caution. The stories attached to the valley did not claim to explain every absence. They marked boundaries and reinforced awareness in a landscape that offered little margin for error. Those early accounts formed the backdrop against which later events would be understood. These early tales set the stage, but it was the arrival of gold seekers and explorers in the early 1900s that made Nahani known far beyond the north. In the early 1900s, the Nahani remained largely unknown to people outside the north, and those who entered it usually did so in search of gold. Reaching the upper river system required weeks of travel by boat and on foot, often along tributaries that were unmapped or poorly described. Travel routes followed rivers because there were no trails through the surrounding mountains and forests. As parties moved farther from the main channel, their safety depended on weather holding, equipment staying functional, and supplies lasting longer than planned. Once a route was committed to, there was rarely a practical way to reverse it. Willie and Frank Mcloud were Métis prospectors, part of a distinct community that emerged from generations of Indigenous and European ancestry in Western and Northern Canada. Métis families were often deeply familiar with river travel, seasonal movement, and survival in remote environments. Many worked as guides, freighters, hunters, and prospectors, moving between indigenous and settler economies. This background meant the Mclouds were not inexperienced outsiders wandering blindly into the Nahani. They understood northern travel and had already completed at least one successful journey into the region. Multiple accounts state that the brothers returned from an earlier trip with enough gold to justify a second expedition. Encouraged by that success, they set out again the following season, heading back toward tributaries of the South Nahani River. After that departure, they were not seen again. The exact dates of their movements differ between sources, reflecting the limited written record of the period. What remains consistent is the gap that followed, during which no confirmed sightings or messages reached family or trading posts. Over time, uncertainty grew about where they had last camped, or which route they had taken. By 1908, concern had turned into action. A search party led by their brother, Charlie Mcloud, entered the valley to look for them. The journey required following the main river and then branching into side valleys where small camps could be hidden by terrain and vegetation. Searching was slow and methodical, limited by visibility, weather, and the sheer size of the area. When the party eventually located the remains near a tributary later known as Headless Creek, both men were dead and both were missing their heads. Camp equipment and blankets were reported nearby, but there was no reliable record of a struggle, no witnesses, and no clear cause of death. The discovery resulted in the surrounding area being labeled Dead Men Valley, fixing the event permanently into the geography. The Mcloud case became a reference point because it occurred early and resisted clear explanation. The valley presented obvious dangers, including injury, exposure, illness, and river accidents. But the condition of the bodies drew attention beyond the region. At the time, there was little capacity for formal investigation, and later interpretations relied on second-hand descriptions. Without a reliable timeline, it was impossible to determine whether the missing heads resulted from violence, animal activity, or post-mortem damage altered by exposure and scavenging. As the story circulated, details shifted, shaped by retelling rather than documentation. In 1917, another discovery reinforced the valley's growing reputation. Martin Jorgensen, described in later accounts as a Swiss prospector, was found dead near the Flat River, beside the remains of a burned cabin. Reports agree on the basic facts but provide little context beyond them. There is no clear record of when the cabin burned, whether Jorgensen had companions, or what condition the site was in before the fire. In a remote setting, a cabin fire can destroy tools, journals, and supplies that might otherwise explain what happened. As with earlier cases, the scene was incomplete by the time it was discovered. Over the following decades, other deaths and disappearances were reported in and around the Nahani. Some involved prospectors following mineral leads, others trappers maintaining seasonal lines, and others people traveling through a region where accidents could be fatal without leaving obvious traces. A frequently cited figure claims that between 1906 and 1969, at least 44 people were reported missing or found dead in the broader area, with 6 of the recovered bodies described as headless and associated with burned camps. These numbers vary by source and are difficult to verify through primary records alone. What can be stated with confidence is that delayed searches and partial recoveries were common, shaping how the valley was discussed. Additional accounts describe companions who vanished during journeys or individuals who left camps and were never seen again, with sites later found abandoned. These stories appear in newspapers, personal recollections, and later summaries, but many lack names, dates, or precise locations. In a region this isolated, stories could circulate without firm documentation. That does not mean every case can be explained, only that certainty was rare. As distance increased and records thinned, outcomes were more likely to be remembered as stories than preserved as facts. With these cases recorded in newspapers and explorer journals, speculation grew. But what theories have people offered, and what fits the known evidence? As reports accumulated over time, explanations followed, shaped by limited evidence and by the long delays between events and their discovery. Any serious attempt to understand what happened in the Nahani has to begin with geography and logistics, rather than intent or motive. The valley covers a wide area made up of branching river systems, side canyons, and elevated plateaus where movement is constrained and visibility is limited. Before aircraft became part of northern travel, reaching these locations could take weeks by river and portage. When someone failed to return, a search often began months or years later, by which point weather, animals, and seasonal flooding had already altered the landscape. Environmental hazards are constant and well documented in the region. The South Nahani River flows through narrow canyons and over sudden drops that are difficult to scout from the water. Cold temperatures increase fatigue and reduce the margin for error, even during summer months. Once a traveler entered a canyon section, steep walls limited escape options and made overland travel slow or impossible. Storm systems moving through the Mackenzie Mountains could bring snow, freezing rain, or high winds with little warning. Under those conditions, an injury that might be survivable elsewhere could become fatal simply because movement stopped. Water travel introduced its own risks. Canoes and small boats were heavily loaded with supplies, making them unstable in rough water. A capsize could separate a person from essential gear in seconds. Cold water reduced survival time and limited the chance of reaching shore. If a body entered the river, it might travel far downstream or become trapped in debris, delaying recovery or preventing it entirely. In some cases, remains may have been found far from the place where death occurred, further complicating later interpretation. Wildlife altered many recovery scenes before anyone arrived. Wolves, bears, and other scavengers are common throughout the Nahani and will return repeatedly to a food source over time. Large animals can move remains significant distances, while smaller scavengers can scatter bones gradually. Seasonal changes affect this process, with thaw and freeze cycles further breaking down what is left. In regions where bodies are exposed for long periods, incomplete remains are common and do not imply violence on their own. For early search parties, this made it difficult to distinguish between cause of death and what happened afterward. Human decisions also played a central role. Prospectors and trappers often traveled with minimal support to reduce costs and increase mobility. Solo travel was common, especially once someone believed they knew a route. Navigation relied on river junctions, ridge lines, and memory rather than precise maps. Fog, snowfall, or forest growth could obscure landmarks that had been clear on an earlier trip. A wrong turn into a side valley could consume days of travel time and supplies. When someone failed to return, there was often no agreed-upon route to retrace, leaving searches unfocused or abandoned altogether. The possibility of interpersonal violence has been raised periodically, but the historical record provides little support for it. There are no consistent reports of repeated violent encounters in the Nahani during the period when most disappearances were recorded. Interactions between indigenous people and newcomers were generally centered on trade, guiding, or shared travel. Accounts of earlier conflicts belong to oral history from much earlier periods and are not tied to specific 20th century incidents involving prospectors or trappers. Without physical evidence, witnesses, or consistent patterns, violence remains an unproven explanation rather than a documented one. Folklore developed alongside these events as stories were repeated and condensed. Indigenous spirit narratives and later frontier legends provided ways to communicate danger and reinforce caution. Accounts of a large, white, wolf-like animal, sometimes referred to as the Wahila, appeared in later retellings, reflecting cultural storytelling rather than confirmed encounters. Early newspapers and magazines emphasized unusual details, particularly references to headless bodies, because those details distinguished one story from another. Over time, repetition gave these elements a permanence that the original sources did not necessarily support. When these explanations are examined individually, none accounts for every case. Environmental danger explains many deaths, but not every disappearance. Animal activity explains some altered remains, but not every report. Human error fits the conditions of travel, but leaves gaps where records are absent. Folklore explains how stories persisted and spread, not what happened in each instance. What connects the cases is a setting where isolation limited observation and reduced what could be known afterward. So what should we make of the Nahani when fact, story, and uncertainty are considered together? The valley does not offer a single conclusion. It is a place where distance delayed discovery, and where documentation was incomplete from the beginning. Some deaths can be explained with confidence, others only in part, and some not at all. That pattern existed before the Nahani gained its reputation and continues because the conditions that shape those outcomes remain largely unchanged.